Hey folks, come on in. We're going to get started in literally a second. Well, a minute. Good afternoon. I'm Larry Jacobs, and I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. And the center is hosting today's program. I'm going to get started by just a quick word about the Certificate in Election Administration, which is the program that is hosting today's very important event. The certificate is a pioneering program that shares best practices with current election officials and for folks who are just coming into the field who want to get upskilled. It's an online program. It's 12 credits. The instructors are all prominent leaders, including our fearless moderator today, Judd Choate. It's accessible 24 hours a day because it's online and the course is organized with a great deal of flexibility. The placement record is quite strong for graduates, and we are now accepting registration for summer and fall terms. So if you'd like more information, here is the link, CEA program at umn.edu. Very exciting course coming up this summer on Introduction to Election Security that looks at cybersecurity threats as well as strategies to protect against them. It's taught by Jennifer Morell. Many of you will know Ms. Morell is one of the stars in election administration. And there will be a whole slew of courses coming up in the fall, and we'll have more information out about that. We're going to get started in our program in a second, but I do want to let you know that your questions are a very important part of the conversation this afternoon, and you will see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. Please give us questions. We're going to get to as many as possible. And as you'll see, very important for today's conversation. It's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Judd Choate, who's Director of Elections on the Colorado Department of State. And he will be moderating today's program and organized or coordinated today's event. Judd, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Larry. I really appreciate it. Welcome to the University of Minnesota's Hubert H. Humphrey Institute webinar on tackling elections, mis and disinformation. We have the perfect set of panelists to discuss these issues. David Maeda, the Minnesota Elections Director, Chris Piper, the Virginia Elections Director, and Kim Wyman, the Senior Election Security Advisor at CISA. And I'll tell you more about each of those as I do a more formal introduction when they're about to speak. In light of the extraordinary proliferation of mis and disinformation related to elections, the Humphrey Institute, through the CEA program, the Certificate of Elections Administration that Larry just described, has assumed a really important leading role in communicating strategies to combat these anti-democratic organized campaigns by bringing together national experts to find solutions, as well as instructing current and future elections administrators on ways to take the offensive in these kinds of conversations. I encourage you to sign up for the Humphrey Institute's April 22nd conference, which is entitled Election Accuracy Going on the Offensive. This is a full day set of panels describing the nature of the problem, the already existing solutions to winning the communications battles, and to protect this most important democratic institution, US elections. Panelists include a discussion with NPR reporter Pam Fessler, a deep dive into how Maricopa was able to win the communications battle with the Arizona legislature and the cyber ninjas, as well as many others to sort of fill out that day and conference. So please see the link in the chat and sign up. Even if you're only able to come to a portion of it, You'll find it to be incredibly instructive. We're really proud of it, and we think it's going to be a fantastic conference. All right, well, with that, we'll kick it off. And our first speaker today is David Mieta. David is the Minnesota Elections Director. He's been in that role since 2019. Before that, he spent 12 years as the Minnetonka City Clerk. I remember when Gary Poser, the former elections director in Minnesota, retired, we all said he was irreplaceable. But David has proven that that wasn't true, because he's quickly become one of the nation's leading voices on election processes and improvements. I'll say on a personal note that Minnesota is sort of the bane of my existence, because each election cycle, I think Colorado is going to beat Minnesota for the highest turnout. And each time I'm sadly mistaken and lose a bet to David. So we all can learn a lot from Minnesota, from their election triumphs. So let me kick it off with David, and you can tell us what Minnesota is doing to tackle these important questions.
Thank you, Judd, and that's a very nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be on the panel. I see your dogs in the background. You'll probably hear from my cats at some point today. They tend to appear in every public forum I attend. But I'll begin my comments with some of what we learned in 2021. And as Judd mentioned, that for 12 years, I was a Minnetonka City Clerk prior to being appointed in this position. Minnetonka is a suburb of Minneapolis, and they have odd year city elections. So they elect their mayor and city council in the odd numbered years. So they had an election in 2021. And I was in contact with them throughout much of the year. I'm still friends with many of my colleagues from the city. And they let me know early in 2021, the temperature from 2020 had carried over and had gotten worse, to the point where poll workers that I had worked with throughout my career in Minnetonka had decided 2020 was going to be their last election. And so they lost a lot of really good community poll workers because of the temperature that just keeps escalating, because all the mistrust from this misinformation and questions about the security and fairness of our voting systems. And so for me, that was a little bit of a marker, because I think that's not unique to Minnetonka. I'm guessing we're going to run across that in 2022 throughout our state, and that's something that's on my radar, to help our local governments make sure that they have enough poll workers. But the other thing, after the election was done, the staff from Minnetonka told me, David, 2021 was far worse than 2020. And that really got me thinking. And I don't like to be the guy that says back in the day, because I've never liked those people, but I am a history major, and I strongly believe if we don't learn from our past mistakes, then we're going to keep doing them over and over going into the future. So I really thought about, as I was preparing for today, some of the things I learned very early on in my election administration career. My first election administration job was in 1996. I was a Washington County election supervisor. Washington County is one of the 7 Twin Cities metropolitan counties. At the time, it was really transitioning rapidly from a very rural county to a suburban county, as the development in the county was just astounding. It was growing rapidly. And I was brought in as the election supervisor. I had no elections background. I was hired in July of 1996. We had a state primary that year in September, and then the presidential election in November. So to abuse the cliche, I was drinking from a fire hose. I was learning it as I was going along. And I made a couple really, at the time it seemed huge mistakes, I think, but there were mistakes I learned from, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those. The first major mistake I made, so on a sample ballot that I had published for the county for the state primary, we had a community in Washington County named Marine on St. Croix. It's a lovely community on the St. Croix River, as the name suggests. And on their sample ballot, I had the audacity to change the name of the city. I added the word "the" to it, so it was, instead of Marine on St. Croix, it became Marine on the St. Croix. And I swear all the thousands of residents of that city contacted me, just totally offended, and I got it. I mean, to me, it wasn't just a mistake one single person made. It made the whole entire county look bad, because it made it look like the county doesn't know its own communities. What are you guys doing? And so that was really a big lesson in learning that in election administration, precision is a really key thing, because if you're not precise, if you make the tiniest of mistakes, then the perception just balloons that we are not competent, we don't know what we're doing. So that was really my first lesson. The other example I'll give from Washington County that I carry forward to this day, and I think it speaks a lot to the environment where we are in. So in 1997, we had a vacancy in our county board. So a county commissioner seat was vacant. And the two candidates that were running that year were my boss, the county auditor treasurer, and the other opponent was the brother of the acting county attorney. And there were basically two cities in the district. Woodbury, where my boss was living, was one of the fastest growing suburbs in Minnesota at the time. And then Afton is the most Colorado-like community we have, Judd, because it's our skiing community. Minnesota doesn't have mountains, but Afton is known for its little resort called Afton Alps, where it's really good skiing. And so the brother of the county attorney was from Afton. So we had these two different communities. And from day one, when it became clear these were the two candidates, of course, the brother of the county attorney was really questioning whether I and my team could really lead a fair election, given that we were reporting to a candidate on the ballot. So he was questioning everything that we were doing administratively, which is fine. I mean, I was happy to try to explain things to him the best we could. Unfortunately, at the same time, there was a nexus where the St. Paul Pioneer Press, which is one of the two daily metropolitan newspapers in our state, hired a reporter to cover Washington County, and the special election, her name was aptly Mary Devine. I thought that was a perfect name for a reporter, but Mary's first assignment really was to cover the special election. So Mary was calling me every day with questions, some of them clearly coming from the opponent of my boss, on our procedures, are we being fair? And to her credit, I think Mary did a really good job. She didn't have any election background, but writing stories that really helped explain the election administration process to the voters in that district. Election day came. I was glad to finally get to election day. I learned a credo of election administrators, which is we don't care who wins. We just hope it's not close enough for a recount. And so that was my view going into the day. About mid-afternoon, Mary called me and said, the Afton candidate has indicated that the Afton precincts in the district are running out of I voted stickers. Woodbury doesn't seem to be having the same issues. He's saying you did this on purpose to encourage Woodbury voters to vote, knowing there's an election going on that day, and discouraging the Afton voters from voting because they didn't see people wearing I voted stickers. What is your response to this? And to this day, I said something I terribly regret. I said, Mary, that's the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my life. And thankfully, she didn't run that quote, because that might have been the end of my election administration career, because it was a lesson. As an election administrator, you can't act in the moment. You have to think about what you're communicating to the press and to the public, because you don't want anyone to think that you're favoring them, that you dislike a candidate. And so that's something I've carried forward. But I mean, the reason I bring up that story is it really illustrates that skepticism about election administration has existed ever since I think elections began. I think it grew exponentially worse following the 2020 election, with all the misinformation and mistrust of our processes and just misunderstanding about simple things like the security measures we do have in place. So to answer what your question was, Judge, some of the things we've done since I became the election director in 2019, one of the first things we did was we followed the lead of other states and we stood up a cyber navigator program. At the time, we were really thinking cyber attacks were something that were kind of new to the election administration field, and we really needed someone devoted to help us protect ourselves from cyber attacks. We happened to make probably my best decision in this job was hiring this person. His name is Bill Ekblad. He has a long career in the military, and he was given very little direction on how the program was to develop. He kind of built it from the ground up. And what he immediately established relationships with our federal partners, including CISA, which Kim is a part of, and our state partners, and most importantly, our local partners. Bill really saw one of the weaknesses was our county folks, election folks, didn't necessarily have good relationships with their county IT. So one of his first things was to go around the state and make sure that he had meetings with both the county elections people in the room and the county IT. And I think he really did help develop, because if those two offices aren't talking to each other in coordination, then something really can get missed, and we can have a vulnerability that we really don't want. And so that was one of the first things we stood up when I started. Thankfully, we're actually doubling the size of the program at the end of April. Bill hired a deputy, so now we're up to 2 instead of 1. And I think that will actually help Bill with some of his work. The other lesson I learned coming out of 2020, in early 2021, I had 2 of my team leave the office, and it wasn't necessarily because of the atmosphere we're now working under. It was they got better job offers, but the 2 happened to be the ones primarily responsible for being the first ones to answer our general email box and our general phone line. And when I did exit interviews with both of them, they both mentioned one of the things that we could improve is our work with our outreach team in the office. That so much of, and this is why we're #1 in the nation in 2020 in voting, Judd, is our outreach team does a great job of explaining to people the mechanics of voting. How do you register to vote? How do you absentee vote? What happens when you show up at the polling place? What do you need to do? They do an outstanding job at that. What we weren't focused so much on was fighting back against some of these things that were spiraling across social media, the misinformation. And so the 2 people that were leaving our office saw that immediately in 2020. And it felt like we never got ahead of things. We were always reacting to the latest thing appearing on social media. So one of the things I've done since that time, I've worked with our outreach team, and we're really trying to develop infographics and simple 1-page sheets where we explain things like our post-election audits, our equipment certification and the testing that goes on in our state before every election on any piece of equipment that is used. And just trying to, we're not going to reach the people that are so far gone, think that the 2020 election was stolen, but we can reach the people that have heard some of these things and have real questions about what do we have in place to ensure fair and secure elections. And so that's been a lot of my focus in 2021, and we're going ahead with that in 2022. We're going to follow other states' leads in creating a specific page on our website where we kind of fight back against some of this misinformation and some of the specific things we're hearing in Minnesota that are clearly not true, but clearly are gathering steam because more and more people are believing it. So I think the best thing we can do going forward is get the right information out in a digestible and understandable way for everybody to understand, knowing that it's very easy to get into the weeds in election administration, to try to over-explain things, but to get simple messages out and help restore some of the confidence that we have lost since 2020. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Judd.
Yeah, I think you were describing me there at the end. I tend to get in the weeds and it doesn't help me. So that's a great point. Thank you, David. So let's move on to Chris Piper. He's the Virginia Elections Director. Chris joined the Virginia Elections Commission in 2018. In just a couple of years, he moved into several really important roles in national elections. He served as a board member for NASED, the National Association of State Election Directors. He was the vice chair of ERIC, and which is the Electronic Registration Information Center, which we use to exchange data on voter lists across states so that we can identify list maintenance opportunities. And he's on the executive board of the EAC Standards Board. Before joining the commission, Chris was the first executive director of the Virginia Conflict of Interest and Ethics Advisory Council. Virginia's really been a leader on mis and disinformation combat programs and so forth. And Chris, why don't you take it and tell us about your work in this area?
Awesome. Thank you, Judd. And thank you all for having me. And David, you kind of, you left off right where I was going to pick up. So perfect. I'm a perfect dance partner. Thanks, David. Virginia is a unique situation. Like New Jersey, the year after the presidential election, we get the joy of having a gubernatorial election immediately on the heels of the presidential election. So we knew immediately following the presidential election and everything that occurred in the lead up to, and of course the aftermath of that election, that a lot of eyes were going to be on Virginia and the way we administer elections. And a couple of things happened that really helped us out. First of all, the General Assembly in Virginia passed the first of its kind in the nation, a Voting Rights Act. It picks up where the Federal Voting Rights Act fell off after the Shelby and the Shelby ruling in the Supreme Court, where we used to have to get pre-clearance for the Department of Justice. But after the Shelby ruling, no need to get pre-clearance anymore. Virginia, just last year, passed this Voting Rights Act, requiring pre-clearance through the Attorney General's office or through a public comment. But along with that, and a number of other provisions that came with it, we were gifted some money, appropriated some money for voter education and outreach. Initially, that was $300,000. Later, the General Assembly came back, recognizing the need for educating the public on elections and how they're administered, appropriated another $1.5 million. So we were really, really lucky to be able to put on this extensive voter education program. But I want to talk about like what our theory was, and David was talking about it quite a bit. What we were thinking about as we were developing our plan was the election administrator's prayer, which David alluded to earlier, and that's the "Dear God, let there be high turnout and wide margins," which is also a great podcast if you get a chance. High turnout, wide margins. But the point being is, we as election administrators, and I've been in this game since 2003, but we as election administrators were very content to stay behind the scenes, to be quiet. We had a successful election if we were not the story. And that's really important. And it was good. It was a good way to go about it. We wanted everybody to come in, get your ballot, cast your vote, go home, watch the returns, the results come in, and the next day talk about the winners and losers. It was really simple. We wanted to stay out of the story. The downside of that, as we have come to learn, is that public knowledge of all that goes into administering elections is lacking. They don't understand everything and all the steps that we do to protect each and every one of their votes. And unfortunately, when you have some bad actors in the room, they will fill that lack of knowledge with false information. And that's what we've seen. And so what we have to do is, as David was talking about, and as Judd was talking about, it's time to explain what we do and how we do it. Unfortunately, it's really complicated and it's not easy. And there are a lot of steps. And you go to a local election administrator's office and you will see the thousands and thousands of checklists that exist just to get to November, right? And to make sure that it's pulled off and that everybody's vote is counted properly. It is a very complicated task. And to explain it in detail, people's eyes glaze over. And so what we were searching for is, how do we get this message out? And to David's point earlier, there's a certain contingent you're never going to reach, but there's those folks in the middle that can be swayed either way, right? And so we were really focused on, how can we reach these people? Well, one thing we know is, on one side of the argument of the false information out there, they're not dealing with facts, obviously, they're dealing in emotion. And how do we reach somebody emotionally? Because I can give you all the facts in the world, but if your confirmation bias is elections are rigged, then the facts are only going to serve to help bolster their case. So let's look at the emotion. So what we really focused on in a lot of ways was how elections are run by everyday people. The fact of the matter is, not only are they run by everyday people, but there are thousands and thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of people that are required to put on a national election or a 50-state election. And it's really important to understand that, because, again, the typical voter only sees the process when they walk into the polling place and then when they're watching the results at home. And so it's important for us to explain, these are your friends, these are your neighbors. Poll workers, we call them officers of election in Virginia. These are people that are dedicated and passionate, that care about our government. They care about making sure that the votes count. These are not people who are out to rig an election, right? These are your friends and neighbors, people you sit next to in church. Appealing to that sense of patriotism, but it's not just an emotional dialogue. It's true. I mean, thousands and thousands of people are needed to put on an election. And when you think about that, just generally thinking about that, like, man, if it takes 100,000, or even in Virginia in 2021, we had over 11,000 officers of elections. That doesn't count the 133 general registrars at each locality and the 399 electoral boards that make up the entire process. So thousands, 11,000, more than 11,000 election officers. When you think about that, widespread fraud or somebody rigging the system, that's really hard to make an argument again for. So that's one piece of what we did. Really focus on the people, the fact that it's run by regular everyday citizens. A second thing that we really tried to do is just kind of demythify these claims that are out there with real easy things to understand. For example, all the steps that go into the absentee balloting process. Without addressing specific claims, false claims, we just talk very simply, very high level. Here are all the secure procedures in place. We talk about logic and accuracy testing on machines prior to. We talk about not being connected to the internet. All of these things are really simple that people can understand and be like, okay, well, that all makes sense. I didn't think about it. Because at the end of the day, one of the things we've really focused on is I actually came up with this because I was running with my running group one day, and a guy I was running with, new to the group, he said, we're stopped at a water stop. He says, hey, I've seen you on TV. You do elections, right? And I said, yeah, and I'm getting all kind of, yeah, I was on TV. It's great. And then he goes, so is that elections thing? Is that like a part-time thing that you do? And so anyway, he doesn't run with us anymore. But beyond that, it's true. I think every election administrator probably has a similar story, right? What do you do the other 3 years there's not an election? So what we really try to appeal to is comparing ourselves to somebody that they may recognize. So I was actually having a conversation with a colleague in state government. He's an emergency manager. He works for the Department of Emergency Management. And it occurs to me, we do the same thing. We sit around and we plan for emergencies. We prepare for emergencies. We're trying to protect against those emergencies. And if that emergency actually happens, we already have a plan in place so that we can clean up as quickly as possible and get back to normal. And that, to me, is right alongside what election administrators do. We spend all year, along with all the other things that we've got to do on a daily basis, thinking about all the things that could go wrong and how to prevent them from happening. And if they happen to happen, how can we clean up from it? How can we protect it again? So no election is perfect, but we are always learning from it. And we're always taking information in so that we can prepare and plan and protect against, protect the vote each and every day. So focusing in on that, relatable stories, we really focused on that. And again, it was, while we were luckily funded, I think while we had commercials and we had op-eds and we did a bunch of stuff, or radio commercials as well, that was all very nice and effective. But really, the most effective thing we did was get out in the community, meeting with people, talking with them directly. And it's disheartening at times because I swear I gave a presentation very similar to all the things that I'm talking about. And a guy came up to me and says, well, I'm glad Virginia's safe, but what about all those other guys? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I was watching TV and I saw a truck come up to a polling place and they unloaded boxes. And that's just an absolute example of fraud. I said, well, I saw a truck come up to my neighbor's house and unload boxes, but that doesn't mean that he's, selling drugs out of it. I mean, so we were trying to explain it, but he kept saying, no, I saw it on TV. No, I saw it on TV. No, I saw it on TV. And so some people were just not going to reach, but the rest of those people in that room really felt heartened that we actually did know what we were doing. We knew what we were talking about. And it really makes a difference. So those are kind of the things that we did here in Virginia to address this mis and disinformation. We've got a website that really focuses on this. So if you go to our website and click on the misinformation link, You'll see our commercial. You'll see a lot of other information that really tries to pull all this stuff together in simple, digestible facts that appeal to people's patriotism and the emotion of, this country and all that we want to do to protect that vote. So again, thank you all very much for having me here, and I'm looking forward to the questions at the end.
All right. Hey, thanks, Chris. You should know, by the way, sadly, we're losing Chris in Virginia. He is moving on to the elections group, which is a very important group of elections professionals which go around the country helping various jurisdictions. So Chris is moving on from Virginia, but he won't be a stranger because we'll all get to work with him in a different role. All right, so let's move on to Kim Wyman. So Kim is the Senior Election Security Advisor for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. That's what CISA stands for at the Department of Homeland Security. She served as the Washington Secretary of State for 9 years. Before that, she was the Thurston County Auditor who ran elections for 12 years. And I was thinking about this, so I don't want to embarrass you, Kim, but I can only think of one other person who had such important, prominent roles at the local, state, and federal level. And so I'm about to compare you to Danetta Davidson, who I'm from Colorado, and Danetta Davidson is, a very high bar to reach. And you are there because you have occupied these really important roles at the three layers of government that, run and oversee elections. So it's really, we're very proud to have you here, and I really do appreciate your time. Can you kind of talk us through what CISA is doing along these lines and how the federal government can help us?
Absolutely, Judd, and thank you. And that comparison really means a lot to me. She was someone I looked up to when I first entered this profession in 1993. So I just edged David out by a bit. I'm not sure if I beat you though. And I share your frustration, by the way, with Minnesota, because every year I think we're going to beat them when I was at the state, and we never did. And I think Colorado was always ahead of us too, but we won't even go into any of that. I just really appreciate inviting me on this panel. And I really, before I get started, I have to offer a note of appreciation for all three of you today, because your leadership in Colorado and Virginia and Minnesota has really provided best practice models for election administrators across the country to draw upon and improve our elections. So thank you for your work there. And you have been just great partners with CISA, and we just really appreciate that. So I know that most of you on this webinar already know that election officials and administrators are planners by nature. I think we heard that from both David and Chris. We love our countdown calendars, our checklists, our policy and procedure manuals. We love implementing laws and administrative rules, and we love after action reviews to identify the places that we need to improve. And in the 4 years leading up to the 2020 election, the election community had really been focused on one thing, and that was resilience. And I really believe that that's what helped us navigate the rapid change that happened between the first lockdown and election day in 2020. So I want to start, because I really want to frame what I'm going to talk about we do here at CISA to help all of the elections community across the country. I want you to remember where you were in December 2019, because I know where I was. Like my colleagues across the country, my team and I were preparing for 2020. And as state and local election administrators were making final preparations for the presidential election year, I don't think anyone had an inkling of what was coming our way. As we prepared for 2020, we anticipated high public interest and high engagement in voter registration, caucuses, primaries, and general elections in each of our states. We expected to combat mis and disinformation from foreign nation state actors. We had contingency plans for everything from earthquakes, fires and floods, to equipment failures, power outages, and cyber attacks. And that planning helped local election officials adapt their models to make in-person and remote voting possible, and provided options to keep voters and workers safe during the pandemic. And I'm not sure it helped officials, but the one thing I will say is I'm not sure it helped officials deal with the unrelenting barrage of accusations threats to their personal safety, or the loss of public confidence in the integrity of our elections. So in looking back, it's clear to me that the threats facing election officials are more numerous, complex, and challenging than they ever have been. So with that gloom and doom start, I'd like to share with you what we do here at CISA to help the election subsector of critical infrastructure overcome these challenges. So I'm going to start with just an overview of CISA and our role in helping states secure our elections, lay out our main priorities for the 2022 election cycle, and then describe some of our core services and resources we make available to stakeholders. So over the last 5+ years since DHS declared election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, CISA has been working in close partnership with election officials across the country to help secure and build resilience in the nation's election infrastructure. Our election-focused mission is to ensure that state and local election officials and their private sector partners have the necessary information and tools to successfully manage and build resilience into the nation's election infrastructure. Our efforts are strengthened by the work of our federal partners, including our partners in the intelligence community, who work to monitor and disrupt the activities of cybersecurity threat actors, as well as collect and share information that may be valuable to election infrastructure network defenders. The FBI and the Department of Justice, who investigate and prosecute potential election crimes, including threats against election officials and cybersecurity incidents targeting election assets. And the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, who tests and certifies voting equipment and distributes federal grant funds to the states, including the more than $800 million earmarked for election security since 2018. We also work with the Federal Voting Assistance Program, the United States Postal Service, and other federal agencies that support the work of election officials. Collectively, we can bring valuable resources to bear to support state and local election officials as we take a whole of government approach to election security. In light of these evolving security challenges, CISA has outlined 5 priorities for this midterm election year. First, we remain committed to sharing actionable intelligence and information with the elections community in a timely manner and maintaining open channels of information sharing about threats and risks to election infrastructure. Second, we are emphasizing guidance and services to help election officials secure voter registration systems and information, which continue to be targeted by malicious cyber threat actors. Third, beyond securing voter registration systems and data, we are redoubling our efforts to promote strong cybersecurity practices across the election infrastructure sector. Incredible progress has been made in this area since 2016, but like everything else, more work can be done, and we have to remain vigilant in the face of the ongoing cyber threats. Fourth, we're expanding our efforts aimed at building societal resilience against combating mis- and disinformation on elections that seek to undermine public confidence in our democratic process. And finally, in partnership with the Department of Justice and the broader national security and law enforcement community, we're expanding services and resources that help keep election officials and voters safe and strengthen the physical security of the nation's election infrastructure. And so part of our dedicated mission, we continue to offer a host of no-cost, voluntary cybersecurity and physical security services and resources to help election officials bolster the security of their online platforms, internal networks, offices, storage locations, and other election infrastructure assets and facilities. So let me talk about a few of our core services and resources. CISA funds the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or EIISAC, which now has more than 3,200 members from across the election community. The EIISAC is our primary channel for distributing cybersecurity alerts to election officials. And these alerts enable election officials to take actions to identify and remediate potential vulnerabilities in their systems. Additionally, CISA provides trainings and exercises such as the annual National Tabletop the Vote, and to provide stakeholders with mechanisms to provide plans and procedures and identify areas for improvement to strengthen their operation guidelines or resiliency to mitigate or recover from an incident. And last, our most prominent service, CISA provides voluntary cyber hygiene scanning, otherwise known as vulnerability scanning, that evaluates a stakeholder's public-facing presence for vulnerabilities. And we share those results for mitigation before a malicious actor can harm the organization. I'm happy to talk about our efforts to support election officials in more detail during Q&A. And as a former state and local election official, I know it takes a tremendous amount of planning to execute an election. So we at CISA support everything in our power to support you in these efforts. Thanks, Judd.
Hey, thank you, Kim. We really appreciate it. And I'll just say, as a state that's worked very closely with CISA, that we've gotten a lot of value out of the various, available options that CISA can offer at no cost, and real experts. We've had CISA folks on site a couple of different times for lengthy periods of time doing full reviews. So really just an amazingly valuable service. And I thank you on behalf of the elections community. I know David and Chris have also taken full advantage of those options. So I recommend to anyone listening, if you have the option to seek out the CISA offerings, please do so. Okay, well, let me kick it off with a question, and then there's already some really good questions in the chat. So let me start with, so when the first wave of mis and disinformation arrived, kind of, and you want to say sort of around the election in 2020, but honestly, it was happening even before then, especially, I feel, Kim, you probably felt that way in a vote by mail state. I mean, we were already fielding a lot of mis and disinformation at that point. But let's say November. So we were, when that first wave hit in November of 2020, it feels to me like we were caught flat-footed because the elections community really wasn't in the messaging business. We didn't have communication stars. We were also busy running an election, and people don't understand that the election doesn't happen on one day and then you're done. It happens for weeks. It happens for weeks before the election day, or before the general election day, and then it happens for weeks after general election day. So we're busy, and all of these different ideas are being pushed out through social media and through the mainstream media that were very difficult to challenge, especially sort of in mid-flight. But it feels like over the past year or so that elections administrators seem to be gaining the upper hand. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how this is happening. First of all, do you think I'm right? And then secondly, if so, what's happening? Is it because the sort of ill-informed are being met with more stringent requirements to sort of demonstrate that their information is correct, or is it because we're doing better at communicating what we do, or some combination? So I'll go in reverse order. I'll go, Kim, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Chris and David.
Sure. I don't think we were caught flat-footed. I think like so much of 2020, it was too much coming at you. If you think back on where we were, that's why I started with December of 2019. We knew what was ahead of us with the presidential election. Then we suddenly had COVID. And then we had multiple states having to completely change their model of conducting an election because of the challenges of COVID and not being able to necessarily have a traditional polling place model, and maybe completely flipping over to vote by mail. And then you had the wave of attacks on absentee voting and vote by mail and fraud, which led into, of course, the accusations that it was a fraudulent election. And the rest, as I say, is history. I think that elections officials actually did a very good job. I think what we weren't prepared for was I don't think anyone was anticipating that the highest office holder in the land was going to make the accusation that the election was rigged. I think if there was one thing that caught people by surprise, and it probably shouldn't have, was that the president of the United States was saying things about vote by mail, saying things about the integrity of the election in a way that I don't think a lot of election officials saw coming. I certainly didn't. And I think that just the power of social media and the ability for people to organize and get messaging out quickly was something we didn't necessarily see coming at us. And then you throw in some of this was probably being advanced by foreign adversaries years before that election ever took place. So I think it really is a shift in our mindset as election officials to really seeing this as an attack vector and seeing it as part of a larger strategy to undermine, quite frankly, American democracy and our republic at a foundational level by hitting elections. So I think election officials hopefully now are getting our second wind, and we need to fight back by sharing our story. I think what David and Chris said earlier is spot on. We have to be telling people what we do and how we do it, because we take for granted that everyone knows it and they don't. And I think that is our best weapon. And then constantly, working together. I can tell you, CISA has worked with members of the election sector to create a rumor control startup guide for web pages and a way to get your information out, a planning and response guide to what you're going to do when that misinformation starts flowing. And we have a wealth of other products that I'm just pitching here, but are available for people to help build that out.
You pitch away. Yes, and in fact, the rumor control page is really important. So we really appreciate that. And in fact, we link to it on our election integrity page. So Chris, what do you think? Are we winning this communication battle or not?
I think we are. And I think we're doing it because, first of all, 2020 in the aftermath, we could look at it as this terrible thing, and it was. But we could also, I'm the eternal optimist everywhere I go. We have to look at this as an opportunity. We do really great work, and we've got some really amazing people running elections around this country. And it's time that we talk about it. And to Kim's point, we need to talk about all that we're doing and all that we're working on. And, we can look back elections from 20 years or further back. The role of an election administrator is night and day from 25 years ago, right? And I think everybody would agree with that. And so now we're looking at needing more resources and needing to really do more to professionalize the position. Not that it's not professional, but this is an opportunity to really talk about that. And I think we are, because I think we all went through the same struggles in 2020. And what happened was we pulled off an incredibly well-run election in the midst of a global pandemic. And I think when you say we got caught flat-footed, Judd, I think it's because we all were like, oh my God, we did this. And we were patting ourselves on the back. And the rest, well, like a big section of the country was saying, no, this is bad. So now we're like, oh, nope, but let's talk about it. And let's show what it is that we do. And when we do that, people are genuinely becoming more knowledgeable and more supporters of the system. And I welcome the questions, and I welcome the people, as David pointed out, the ones who are uninformed that want to be informed. Bring it on. Like, we're transparent. We want to show you how it is we do what we do. And that's a critical step that we can take. And this is an opportunity to do that. So I think we are making strides. I think, a few more elections, a few more successful elections, and more people will start to realize, hey, we've got a great system here in the country, and we need to prop it up as much as we can.
Yep. Thank you. And just touching on one point that Chris just made, if you want to become more professionalized in your elections administration, Minnesota has a certificate in elections administration program that you should learn more about. And in fact, I'll talk about it here as we close out the webinar here at the end. David, pick up on that. Are we winning these communications battles?
Well, Judd, I'll actually pick up on your last statement. So I've been fortunate. One of your assignments obviously is for students in the program to talk to an election administrator. So I've talked to several people in the program, and as disheartening as 2020 was, it's equally inspiring to hear that young people are still interested in getting involved in election administration. So it's been a delight to talk to the students in the program. But not to change the analogy, because I just revealed to Chris the other day that I play curling. I don't think we were caught flat-footed. I feel like we were caught sliding down the ice and we couldn't turn around on the ice because we're already going in one direction. But I think, to answer your question, yes, definitely. I feel in a much better place today than I did 6 months ago. I think one of the things I forgot to mention in my comments was one of our strategies, and Chris touched on a little about how people trust their own state, but are suspicious of what's going on in the rest of parts of the country. I think locally that's true too. The message isn't best necessarily coming from the Secretary of State's office. It's best coming from the township clerk, the city clerk, the county clerk. And so our strategy really is to come up with some consistent messaging that everyone across the state can use, but it's coming from the mouths of the local folks who the voters in that community hopefully trust and know. And so that's one of our strategies. And I think that's one of the things I feel confident can help us get ahead of things a little bit.
Yep. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of questions. We have literally dozens of questions. So we're going to do lightning round so we can get through as many as we can. So I'll kick it off with one. So we have a question asking, there was a wealth of new money that came into the 2020 election cycle from outside sources. So there was the Mark Zuckerberg money, the Jeff Bezos money, and then there was some supplemental money that we got from the federal government in early 2020. So the question is sort of a two-parter. Is it concerning at all that states are now limiting access to these outside funding sources? And simultaneously, is there enough state and federal funding to support our elections going forward? Or is that gap now, big enough that losing that extra money is going to be damaging to our election? I'm going to start with Chris Piper, who has his hand up. Yeah.
I wanted to jump on this because Virginia just passed this legislation. The argument I made in committee was that 2020 was an unprecedented year. And it required unprecedented steps that we needed to take. And we did everything open and transparent. What frustrates me about all of that talk is that there's a lot of misinformation there about how that money was spent, about where it was spent, about it was all secret, and none of that is true. It was all very open. It's very transparent. It was to all sorts of localities and around the country. And it was necessary because we were conducting an unprecedented election. That said, I think that everybody could have some concerns that if private money is coming in to fund elections, that it could, even if it's not, the optics can look bad. And that's an understandable concern. We have to be careful about the way that legislation is drafted, though, because we rely on volunteers. We rely on all sorts of things. I mean, for example, we were gifted from local breweries and distilleries hand sanitizer early on in the pandemic. And I don't know that, back then we were afraid to touch paper. So so this was kind of all necessary. But my point is going forward, we have to be careful about that legislation because we could do untoward harm to election administration without really thinking it through. So reactive legislation like that could be a problem. Secondly, I think that I think that was my main point. But I do think that it's important that we consider it, but we consider it thoughtfully going forward.
Sounds good. Do either David or Kim want to chime in on that one, or should we move to the next question? Next question. Okay, so looking on the screen, I see Colorado, Minnesota, Virginia, and Washington. Kim, I'm putting you back in Washington. All four of those states are in ERIC. And ERIC has become a bit of a ping pong ball on this conversation about whether these outside organizations, although I think we all know that it's an inside organization, but these outside organizations have an outsized role in the way that elections administration is conducted. Does anybody have any thoughts about Eric's inclusion in this conversation and what that sort of means for the broader conversation about mis and disinformation in elections?
I can start that one, Judd.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, again, the allegations against Eric are completely based on just information about who's actually funding it. I think bipartisanly, you can get support on the purpose of Eric is to make sure that our voter registration rolls are up to date and current. And that's kind of why we're all members of Eric. And I think, again, we need to do a better job explaining that. And going forward, I include in every presentation I'm doing to our local officials, I'm including our role in Eric because I don't even think our locals understand what Eric is. And so I think this is a really good example of something that just needs to be explained on what it is and why we use it. And the purpose is, I think, genuinely bipartisanly supported, keeping the voter registration rolls up to date.
Yeah. Okay, well, let me jump to next question in the lightning round. So really interesting question, interesting take on this. So one of the big issues with mis and disinformation related to elections is that it's coming from lawmakers. So it's coming from people who have hypothetically been successful in an election and in the model in which it was conducted, but then want to challenge the way it was conducted or feel like it was done in a way that suggests that there might have been fraud. What can elections administrators, what can the federal government do to convince or train or better convey what we do so as to sort of mitigate this lawmaker issue? Kim?
Well, I think this is, at least my experience, 30 years of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party showing an explanation for why they lose. On the right, it is voter fraud is the only reason we lost. And on the left, it's voter suppression. And they've used that narrative on both sides very effectively to raise money, to get their bases energized to participate in elections. And I think what we saw in 2020 is that all came to a head. And all of a sudden, they actually started believing it on both sides. And, I like to be bipartisan in how I talk about this. And I think that what we need to do to combat this misinformation, particularly with lawmakers, is that education piece. Again, what David and Chris alluded to, it's more powerful to hear from someone that your kids go to school with, or you go to church or the synagogue with. If they tell you about elections and they're telling you about their role as a poll worker or as an election worker, that's more powerful than anything that I could do here at CISA or a Secretary of State could do or an election official. So I think it is constantly getting the word out about what we do, how we do it, and get re-energized by that, because you know what? We are good at what we do. I'm proud of the 2020 election and how election officials conducted that election. When you think of the insurmountable odds we were facing and what a well-run election that was. And it's unfortunate that the narrative has undermined that, but we got to get back to the basics and we got to share the story. And the more we can do that, the better we're going to be.
Outstanding. Thank you, Kim. So we've come to the end of our hour. I'm so sorry that I couldn't get to the other 23 questions that we have queued up. But it just shows, I think, the interest that people have in these topics. And I do really appreciate everybody's willingness to supply those questions. And I think we got to a couple sort of the broader topics. Let me do a reminder. So you should see in the chat a link to the April 22nd conference that we have all scheduled from the Humphrey Institute. It's going to be a fantastic conference. Please sign up. Please join us. You will not, that will not be a wasted time in your day, because we're going to have some really interesting panels. And then let me also describe what you see on the screen, which is that we have a great program for elections administration education at the University of Minnesota Humphrey School. And really the kinds of issues that we're talking about today: mis and disinformation, election security, elections administration generally, election law. Those are the kinds of programs, kinds of classes that we teach in that program. So if you want to know more about these topics and learn even more information about some very important parts of elections administration, please look up more information about the CEA program at the University of Minnesota. You can also sign up with that direct link to the April 22nd conference and contact the CEA program at the University of Minnesota at umn.edu for more information. And just a note, if you want to go back and watch this or distribute it more broadly to other people who were unable to attend today, it will be posted at our election security website at the University of Minnesota in 1 to 2 days. So you can get that link and go back and watch or distribute it to others. Hey, thanks, David, Chris, Kim. We really appreciate you joining us for this webinar, and I hope all of you that were able to join us got something out of it. Thanks again.